Welcome to the New York Now podcast, a modern wholesale market for retailers and specialty buyers seeking diversity and discovery. Gathering twice a year in America's design capital, New York City, it's where buyers and designers unearth a refreshed and dedicated collection of eclectic lifestyle products.
Manpreet Kalra is an anti-racism educator, host of the Art of Citizenry podcast, and brand marketing expert on a mission to decolonize storytelling. She is an advocate for fostering cultural humility and social impact through inclusive brand narratives. She has dedicated her career to exploring the relationship between digital media, social impact, and justice. With a background in venture capital and startups, she launched Art of Citizenry to coach conscious companies. She uses an intersectional approach to address inclusion in all aspects of a business, from product development to marketing. She is the co-founder of Reclaim Collaborative, an online community dedicated to fostering justice and equity across the sustainable fashion and lifestyle ecosystem. She is also a founding member of the Fair Trade Federation Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee, known as JEDI, which is dedicated to making fair trade more inclusive. Manpreet, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here and have this conversation with you.
It's an important conversation. Let's break it down a bit. What does anti-racism and social impact mean, and how does it relate to racism?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think that before we can start talking about anti-racism, it's first important for us to define what racism even means. Everyone has a very vague understanding or definition of racism. In the context of this conversation and the conversation of the webinar that we'll be having, the way I define racism and the definition I have come across that I think really resonates well when it comes to thinking about social impact and systemic change is that racism is a prejudice against someone based on race when those prejudices are reinforced by systems of power. And I think that idea of systems of power is just so important for us to dissect because that is often what social impact is built around, right? There are these preconceived understandings of what it means to function as a society. And often those notions are built around a colonialist mindset. And so for me, I think that it's really important that we talk about how we can be more anti-racist and approach and change some of the systems we operate in when we are talking about social impact. Anti-racism in itself is the active process of identifying and eliminating racism in systems, policies, and attitudes. And oftentimes we focus a lot on attitudes, but we don't actually think about the systems and policies that allow those attitudes to exist to begin with. Those systems and policies can be anything from the idea of how we think about fair trade as purely a concept around the global north working with artisans in the global south. There's a power dynamic there. The United Nations, when they talk about their sustainable development goals, there is definitely a huge underpinning in sustainable development goals that is focused on countries of color or countries that have been previously colonized. And I think we have to first realize that these expectations around how we approach change do come from a colonialist mindset, and really breaking down those mindsets is really important when we want to have authentic conversations around social impact.
Wow. How does all that make a positive impact in our businesses and society?
Yeah. So I think that oftentimes what we do is we really approach impact with a cookie cutter approach. We often focus a lot on economic justice without having an intersectional approach to what justice looks like. It does involve understanding the ecosystem that you're working in and really creating these alliances and relationships with people who are already doing the work, right? The reality is that impact does not scale like a business. And I think when we think of businesses alone can create these huge changes in society, that's where social impact and the idea of impact-driven businesses fall short. We need to realize that we are just one player in a larger ecosystem. And I think that's what's really important to dissect and really think about when we want to actually make positive change. When we want to make positive change, it's important to understand the systems we're operating in.
It sounds like you provide a path for us to challenge not only ourselves to think outside of our normal manner, but also to hold our business connections, our resources, and society accountable to advance as well.
Yeah, most definitely.
How are we to start implementing this type of change?
I think one of the best ways is to really address power dynamics, right? There's power dynamics in the way we operate our business. There's power dynamics in the way we think about the relationships we build. Oftentimes we don't realize that power dynamics are not just racial, they're economic as well. They're educational. They are based on a variety of they could be gender based, and those power dynamics are very fluid and they change depending on circumstances, right? I worked in the startup and venture capital world, and in that space the power dynamic that I experienced was based on gender. So I had less power oftentimes in meetings because of my gender, not necessarily my race. However, one of the classic examples I like to share with people is ever since I entered the social impact space, people often assume that I'm an artisan. I could not potentially at all be a speaker at New York Now. I could not be a business owner, a founder, a marketing expert, an anti-racism educator. None of those things are what people think about when they see me, because they see the color of my skin and they just automatically assume that I work with an artisan group. Right. So those are subconscious power dynamics that do play a role in how we approach our business and how we approach the systems we operate in. So I think for businesses, one of the most foundational ways that you can start having a more anti-racist mindset in the way you approach your business is by thinking about and really reflecting on the power you hold in the relationships that you foster. And if you're able to have a really honest conversation on your power and understand how your power may actually shape the conversations you have, the experiences that you have as well, working with makers and producers in the global South, you're going to realize that once we start addressing power dynamics, we can actually start addressing sometimes that savior language that plays a role in how brands develop their brand identity, in how brands market themselves. For me, I would say my personal mission is to decolonize storytelling. So for me, I feel that it's really important that brands think about the power of language. And often the language that we use is influenced by the power that we hold as individuals.
It also sounds very much like self-awareness and understanding who our audience is and realizing that what we share and what we say is not necessarily what's interpreted. So
yeah,
we need to make those adjustments.
Yeah, one of the classic things that I tell people is one of the most used words in social impact is empowerment. And it's kind of become like the go-to language for a feel-good, mission-driven brand. But the word empowerment is a really loaded word. It is a word that has a lot of connotations, and it also implies that the person on the receiving end has no power and that you have all the power. It takes away any form of agency. And I think that, oftentimes when I tell people, please rethink how you use the word empowerment, people struggle with that because that's become so quintessentially part of the language we use in the social impact space. But kind of like what you were saying earlier, right, is we have to rethink language because the language that we use, maybe the way we talk within ourselves and our communities and the artisans that we're working with may not necessarily apply. That connotation is not necessarily received by customers, right? So we have to think about the power of the words we use and what it implies and how people perceive what you are saying, because oftentimes those very words are what reinforce racial stereotypes, they reinforce power dynamics, they reinforce power structures that are rooted in racism and colonialism.
Well, I can share that what you said has just completely resonated with me, and I think it's interesting when you find an element that has that makes you react, just as I am with you, making this recognition of language and what it means to me in my daily communications and who I'm dealing with. I've always been acutely aware that when I talk to buyers who are buying for different categories, there's a different language. We all have the same underlying cause or focus, but different words relate and create a different reaction. And it makes perfect sense, especially when we're talking with a culturally diverse group of people, that words have a different meaning and inflections have a different meaning.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
that moment of self-awareness seems like that is one of our very first steps that we can take.
Yeah. And I think it's also not just cultural diversity that we need to focus on. It's also the power that people hold in a situation, right? Oftentimes, what we don't realize is, I'm going to give you an example, right? Is if I enter a fair trade shop and I see a beautiful necklace, and the necklace says, this purchase is empowering a woman in this remote village of India, right? And my heritage, when people ask me, they assume that, okay, you are Indian, you are brown, you are Indian. I actually don't necessarily identify as Indian. I identify as Punjabi, which is a region of what is now India, but it was actually divided between India and Pakistan as a result of colonization. But one of the things I want to say there is, in that moment, I actually have a lot of power because I'm the one who's buying the product. I'm the customer, and I'm not the person who's photographed. I'm not the person whose story is being shared. I have a lot of power. So it's not necessarily only about cultural differences. It's also about understanding that each person has a different level of power in any given situation. And the language we use often reinforces those power structures of how a customer living in the West has more power than a maker living in the global South, right? And we may have more power when it comes to financial and economic power structures, but oftentimes there's other layers to power where we have to recognize that we are equals. And oftentimes those power structures create more inequity.
Let's jump back into that language for a minute. So I
Yeah.
believe we have a term that you may have coined called heropreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us what that means and how does this impact the way we approach mission-driven businesses?
So I've not coined heropreneurship. Actually, the person who did coin it, her name is Daniela. She's a professor, a PhD, and she first started working around the concept of heropreneurship. And it's something that I have gotten a chance to really explore and apply very much so into the social impact space. And in particular, like if we're talking in the concept of brands that are at New York Now, right?
Mhm.
Oftentimes brands that have some sort of mission driven aspect, right? We talk about home goods, we can talk about fashion brands, we can talk about gifts, like all of those business types of businesses that have some sort of mission around them. Oftentimes the mission comes from a lens of wanting to save, right? It's like wanting to help, be the hero of the story. So people who, go into these projects or businesses saying, I'm going to create a social venture in an effort to solve poverty in a remote village of India. I'm going to use India as an example because I feel like I can. In a remote village of India. And the reality that often plays a role here is the hero, right? Tom's Shoes is actually your classic heropreneur example. What happens as a hero is you end up going in with this mindset that your business alone can solve this complex issue. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is that businesses alone cannot solve the complexity of poverty. It cannot solve the complexity of female infanticide. It cannot solve the complexity of some of the systems issues that take place, right? One of the classic ones is human trafficking that people kind of put out there is like, we are going to save this community from human trafficking without first unpacking what the nuanced reasons around why human trafficking exists, what it even looks like, and what are actual needs within the community. And oftentimes I think that the heropreneur is the person who feels that they are the hero of the story. They can solve these complex issues by creating this great vision of a business. And I really encourage people to not have that mindset, because what that does is we actually don't then collaborate with those who are already in that space trying to solve some of these issues. So to me, true sustainable change exists beyond your business. It has to exist beyond your business. Otherwise, you're not actually doing something that is as impactful as you may think it is.
And I would think that the act of a collaboration, there's so much more that evolves from that you may not even be anticipating.
Most definitely, right? I think that oftentimes social impact businesses, social enterprises fall into the trap also of cultural appropriation. And oftentimes that happens because you're going in with an outside perspective and you're mesmerized by a culture and you want to take parts and inspiration from a culture. So oftentimes what I tell people is we need to rethink who the designer is. You are not the designer. That community that created that design is the designer. And working with local designers, working with people who are already embedded into that community is a much more sustainable way to create a social impact than to go in with your outside lens and try to fix issues without first understanding the systems that allow for those issues to exist in the first place.
Sure, that makes perfect sense. So why is this so important to you? Like, what inspired your journey to incorporate social impact into your work?
Where do I begin?
We'll start at the beginning and we're right here with you.
All right, perfect. So I kind of mentioned this a little earlier. My background's in startups and venture capital, and I had always been really interested in the concept of impact investing, which is this idea of VCs investing in mission-driven businesses. And that's when I started really understanding some of the issues with business models like Tom's Shoes. And I personally was on this goal of what is the best way for me to incorporate more impact into the work I'm doing. If impact investing is you have to have a lot of funds to be an investor. So if impact investing is the long-term goal, how do I kind of get to that point? And for me, I decided I wanted to go and try to see what it would be like if I wanted to start my own business. And part of that was I'm an academic at heart, and I love to really dissect and break things apart and really understand them. And for me, I was really curious to understand, what does good supply chain transparency look like? Like, what does it mean to have supply chain transparency? And so I went to Punjab and I was really interested in working with a form of traditional embroidery work from Punjab. And so I started meeting with artisan groups and starting to even think about creating my own collection of home goods at the time. And I realized, that there's this idea of me thinking that because I'm from that region, that I understand the nuance of the problems that exist there, was something that I had to really realize was problematic. Because even though my heritage is Punjabi, that doesn't mean I understand at all what it means to live in Punjab, work in Punjab, be in Punjab. And I don't understand the nuances of some of the issues that the communities there face, because I don't live those. I live in the US. I'm from California, right? I am essentially, since I was 6 months old, a Californian, and now a Seattleite, I suppose. So regardless, that was one thing that I realized. And I ended my time, this was a 2-month trip, very transformative. I kind of came back before I came back, I ended my trip at the World Fair Trade Organization conference, which was by chance happening in Delhi, India at the time. And it was a great chance for me to meet people who are in the space doing work, who are operating social enterprises. And I really got to understand, what does it mean to be fair trade? I actually, till that point, did not understand what it meant to be fair trade. And so I really started asking around and really building these relationships and getting to know the community. And I came back and I was kind of exhausted emotionally, didn't really know what I was doing. It was a very transformative trip, not because I was in a different country, but because I learned so much to the point where I was like paralyzed, right? You kind of like learn so much to the point where you're like, I don't even know what to do with this information
Too
now.
much to process.
Yeah, exactly. And so I had to give myself the time and space to really go through some of the learning points. And I realized for me that one of the things I noticed was in social impact, in fair trade, in social enterprises, in the do good space, whatever you want to call it, ethical, sustainable, the minority voice is often lost. And I did not see myself in any shape or form in those sectors. And I didn't feel necessarily like I belonged. Not to say that people were not welcoming. I actually built some really beautiful relationships through my work and through the World Fair Trade Organization. I built some amazing relationships. Not to say no one was welcoming. It's just that I didn't feel like my experience as a person of color living in the global north was very represented. And I felt that oftentimes I was being put into a box because of people's preconceived notions about what it means to be from a country of the global south. And that kind of led me down the path I'm on. And part of that comes with, going into that fair trade shop and seeing every swing tag with a woman that looks like she could be me, and having the classic like sad story, right? There's a thing called like poverty porn or trauma porn that people have really been talking about, which is very much quintessential part of ethical storytelling and marketing. And for me, my personal mission is to really change that. And I feel really passionately that if we want to be truly anti-racist as a society, it's important to address ways that we play a role in those systems.
Wow. Well, first, I know that you are a member of the New York City Fair Trade Coalition. And you've just explained a little bit about how fair trade is activating and impacting consciousness globally. And you've spoken about storytelling now a little bit, a couple of times, and that we know it's considered a huge part of marketing artisan-made products. And you've shared some thoughts on that. Is there anything else that you can expand? Those are two really important points that I want to make sure we really dive into a little bit.
Yeah. And so one of the other things is, I've recently joined the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee at the Fair Trade Federation, which is a awesome fair trade body that I encourage everyone, if you are interested in fair trade, to learn more about. But I will say that one of the things that is important when we are addressing storytelling in fair trade, and when we are addressing storytelling when it comes to your business as a whole, especially if you are an impact-driven business, is to really think about, as I was saying earlier, language is important, but also asking yourself, am I coming off as a savior? I think that's a great checkpoint for people to have, because oftentimes that language is what influences what we call saviorism, right? And so really checking, like, am I coming off as a savior? Am I taking away agency from the individuals who I am working with, right? One of the things I tell people is, if you want to really break down and create truly an ethical business, is you have to recognize the makers that you are working with, may it be the artisans, makers, farmers, whatnot. They are the reason your business exists, right? To think that you are somehow doing them a favor and that your relationship is purely one-sided is quite naive, right? Without them, you would have no business, you would have no product for people to buy. So recognizing that it's a mutually beneficial relationship is just the stepping stone. And we'll talk more about, exact details around how you can be more thoughtful in the language you use during the webinar. But I think, really thinking about cultural hegemony, which is this idea of, am I reinforcing cultural dominance, where I believe that I know how people should operate within their lives and their systems? Am I going into my relationships with a savior mindset, where I feel that I have all the power in the world and that these people don't have any power? And am I treating people as equals? I think, one of the big things is storytelling is not just about words, it's also about visuals. And there's something to be said that, let's just break it down, right? So, photography of minors in the United States, you have to get consent from a parent before posting an image of a minor, period, right? You have to get consent. However, for some reason, when oftentimes brands and entrepreneurs are traveling to the global south and visiting villages in Africa or in India or wherever, right? Like, there is this almost this understanding of consent goes out the door. And there is a feeling of, well, I don't need to ask for permission before I publish this child's photo on my Instagram. And we really need to revisit how we treat people as equals, because we need to understand that the standards that we apply in the United States should be the standards that, if we really want to treat others as equal, we can't just say, oh, I'm going to ask permission if I'm photographing a child here, but I would never ask permission if I'm photographing a child.
So maybe unconscious power dynamics.
Yeah, unconscious bias, unconscious power dynamics. Totally. And I think that plays a huge part in the way brands then market and talk about their business.
So you've covered a lot here and you've shared a lot. And I know that later in the month, you're going to be able to go much deeper into this. So before we end, let's just remind our listeners, what are some anti-racism principles to practice for socially minded businesses?
Yeah, most definitely. So there are like 5 things that I like to always tell businesses that they should think about. One is recognition. So the first one is like, recognize that your relationships are mutually beneficial. Without the artisans, suppliers, farmers, your business would not exist. So that's one place to start. Representation, right? Representation is something that is often overlooked. I think a lot of businesses are doing performative representation right now, just given the state of affairs that we are in as a country, and I think globally as well. But representation in that sense is improving representation in your visual storytelling and building a diverse team, right? It's not just about the photos that you're posting on your Instagram, but it's about incorporating representation into your business, right? Just to say that, oh, we have a diverse business because all of the artisans we're working with are people of color is not representation. Representation is having leadership that is also people of color, having diversity at every single level of your business is so important, and also in your visual storytelling. So if you are producing in India, make sure you have Indian models also showing your products, right? So the reality often is you look at someone's Instagram feed and a brand's Instagram feed, and you'll notice that all the photos of people of color are typically artisans, and all the photos of models are typically white. And that's something that we need to change. Representation is just so, so, so important. The third thing I often say is community, right? So build alliances and know how the ecosystem you're working in operates. If you're going to be working in a community other than your own, it's important to first understand the ecosystem you're entering, right? You cannot go in with preconceived notions. This is where I think concepts like cultural humility are really important, which is this idea of being okay with putting your ego aside and being a learner. And I think community is just a very important aspect of that. Context. So understand the cultural norms of the community you're working in. Oftentimes we impose our own norms on communities, but as part of practicing cultural humility, you also then understand the context you're working in, and you understand the norms of those who you are working in. And then finally, language, right? Like change the words you're using when you convey impact. There's no room for savior language, which includes empowerment, voice to the voiceless, saving. This is just like a few of the classics that you often hear. But yeah, I think that if you can start with those 5 aspects, that's a great place to start having a more anti-racist mindset when it comes to your business.
This is wonderful. This is a great list. I appreciate this. I want to hear a little bit about Art of Citizenry.
Yeah, most definitely. So I am both a brand marketer and an anti-racism educator. And Art of Citizenry is my business that brings those two together. So I work with businesses on how to use an anti-racist mindset in their marketing strategy. And I provide educational content to help them also guide that journey forward. Because the reality is, I don't ever think that you can just do a check mark on, I took an anti-racism workshop, therefore I get it. That's not how this works. It's a learning process. I too am learning, and my goal with Art of Citizenry is to continue to foster a community of learning and unlearning, because I think we can all take some time to do both.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's Art of Citizenry. I curate a lot of resources that I think are really helpful. I have a podcast that I do that addresses some of these issues, in which I talk to not just, mostly recently has been social enterprises and social entrepreneurs, but not just social entrepreneurs, but people across the network who all have different aspects on how we address power dynamics as a society and in our businesses. So those are the different aspects of Art of Citizenry and the work I do.
And how can somebody reach you?
So if you just visit artofcitizenry.com, that's the best way to reach me. You can also find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Manpreet Kalra. It's at ManpreetKalra. So those are the 2 best ways to get in touch.
So Manpreet, this has been really very educational. I can't wait to hear your webinar when you do a much deeper dive into all of this.
Most definitely.
So appreciate your time and your insights. I know that our listeners will be able to take action and make change based on what you've just broken down for us today. I'm looking forward to talking and hearing from you more. And I just want to say thank you so much for your time. This has been a real pleasure and very eye-opening.
Oh, I'm so glad. And thank you for having me and opening yourself to this conversation. I know that for many people, it's a very hard conversation to have. But I think that the thing I like to tell people is, as hard of a conversation as it is for you, is that's how hard of a conversation and a daily life it is for people of color. And so to be able to then open ourselves up to understand and really grow together, I think that these conversations cannot be one way. They have to be 2 ways. And as I mentioned, I feel like part of what I love about the work I do is I am also constantly learning. And I think that that's just part of the journey, is we all have to just open ourselves up to learning and unlearning.
It is part of the journey. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. It has been a pleasure.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to the New York Now podcast. Make sure to tune in weekly for engaging and insightful conversations touching on the most relevant topics facing our community today. Visit NewYorkNow.com to learn more about our market and how you can join in on the conversation.